Welcome back to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Indiana falls 80-69 in overtime on Monday night at Ohio State. And to help us make sense of this current 5-game losing streak and to look ahead to the final stretch of the season, Indiana with 4 regular season games to go, and then the Big Ten tournament in Indianapolis, Tyler Tachman of Inside the Hall is here. Tyler, things aren't going so well for IU basketball right now. What was your reaction to last night's game in Columbus?
It felt a lot like the Wisconsin game in that there's 2 minutes left about in both of them, and it seems like Indiana's going to be able to pull it out. And then in both games, just the last 2 or so minutes of regulation was pretty much about as bad as you possibly could have forecasted it to go. And I just think Indiana just has lacked an ability to make plays when they matter most. And I feel like this is kind of the issue going back to last season as well. When you get down into crunch time in games down the stretch of the season, Indiana just can't make plays. And I think what's so frustrating probably for fans is that it's the lack of, I hate to use the word execution because I feel like that's a word that coaches use, kind of a coaching buzzword, but it's just like bad passes, bad shots. It's not good basketball really by any means. And I feel like that's what we saw the last couple of minutes. And I don't know if that's a mental thing where players tighten up, but the inability to put games away has plagued Indiana. And there's just been so many opportunities this season where you say, well, what if they had been able to beat Syracuse? What if they had the 22-point lead at Wisconsin? What if they had won that? What if they had been able to not let Johnny Davis go off in the last 2 minutes last week? I just feel like there's so many like what ifs, and at a certain point, there's just too much to overcome. And I feel like we're nearing that point pretty quickly right now.
So I think you have an interesting perspective on this because you saw this team play for the first time when they were together as a group in the Bahamas, and there was a lot of promise about some of the new guys that were coming in, Tamar Bates, the transfers. There was a lot of interest at that point, and just seeing how this was all going to fit together. I'm curious, what do you think? What has surprised you the most in terms of the lack of development with some of these guys? And do you think there's any particular reason that some of these transfers maybe haven't worked out as well as people thought they would when they originally signed and ultimately started back in the Bahamas? Because it seemed like it was always going to be somewhat of a challenge to fit some of these pieces together, but at least Indiana brought in some guys that had, one or two skills that could help the team, like Miller Kopp and Parker Stewart, shooting, Xavier Johnson, playmaking, being able to set other guys up. Michael Durr was supposed to bring in some size and be able to back up a guy like Trace Jackson Davis. Tamar Bates was, a borderline 5-star recruit. And it seems to me like all of those guys have had flashes this season of productive play, but their lack of development over the course of the season has been a little bit head scratching to me. Are you surprised at just how Indiana, as I don't want to say failed to develop these guys, but the lack of improvement for some of these players over the course of the season, has that surprised you?
I think it's interesting you bring up the point about the Bahamas because I was thinking about that earlier, in that just how impressed I was in the Bahamas. And obviously now in getting into the Big Ten grind and stuff is a totally different situation than it was in the Bahamas. But it's just surprising to me to think back on that and think about how good Indiana looked, even though they didn't shoot the ball well offensively, just like how good the movement was. Because that's one thing that really stood out to me in watching them, is that it was just continuous movement. It was basically a 180 from what we had seen in the Archie Miller era. And now I feel like they've kind of regressed back to that sort of standing around, not really much excitement offensively. So, thinking back to the Bahamas, it's like if you look from there to where they are now, like I said, the circumstances are different, but it's hard for me to say like, yeah, offensively, Indiana is a better team now than they were back when I saw them play, because just based on the eye test, I would say that Indiana looked by far better in the Bahamas. So I think that's one thing that's really concerning, is that, like we were saying, just the development is that there's all these pieces and they each kind of add a certain thing, but they haven't been able to come together. And it's like, it's the same kind of deal as last season. When you look at a guy like Jerome Hunter, kind of a tons of potential. And it's like, yeah, the pieces are there. But they just don't come together in a cohesive way. And I feel like that's kind of what we're seeing again this season. And from an offensive standpoint, I think there's a lot of issues with Indiana's offense, but the one that kind of sticks out to me is that everyone is just too one-dimensional. Is that Miller Kopp and Parker Stewart can shoot, whether they've done that at a consistent clip or not. That's what they're there to do. They're there to shoot. Xavier Johnson can make plays. He can, he's elusive with the ball. But if you're looking at a whole, and I'll add in like Trace Jackson Davis is really good near the basket, but he has not shown the ability to step out and make shots. Race Thompson, I don't know if he's made 3-pointers at the clip where it's enough to keep defenses honest. So I think it's just, there's a lot of one-dimensional offensive pieces, because if you look at Parker Stewart and Miller Kopp, both of them don't add much besides shooting. Parker Stewart has shown a couple times where he's been able to create stuff off the bounce, but not really on a consistent basis. Xavier Johnson, he hasn't shot at a bad clip from 3, but defenses aren't willing to respect him. They're just going to go under every screen, which makes it difficult for him to kind of get downhill. So I just look at all of the pieces offensively, and that they all can add kind of one element, but they're just one-dimensional, and that's what makes defenses able to kind of just stack in the lane, or just take out, one specific area of a player's game, and then that just kind of takes away them as a whole.
Our friends at Homefield produce the world's most comfortable premium licensed collegiate apparel out of their headquarters in Indianapolis. Run by IU grads, Homefield studies Indiana's history to come up with the most unique apparel designs available for Hoosier fans anywhere. Our current favorites at Podcast on the Brink are the 1987 National Champs t-shirt commemorating IU's last national championship, and the vintage 1965 Indiana University Bison t-shirt. And it's not just Indiana apparel available at Homefield. They're constantly adding new schools to the over 120 currently available at homefieldapparel.com. Podcast on the Brink listeners can save 15% off of your first purchase by using code BRINK15 during checkout at homefieldapparel.com. I want to talk about last night's game in particular down the stretch. I feel like it was a major opportunity for Indiana to get a quad 1 win. It definitely would have moved the needle in terms of the tournament resume, which we're going to talk a little bit about later, because Andy Bottoms just had his latest bracketology post on Inside the Hall this morning. But that last minute, to me, there was, and I tweeted something to the about this immediately after the game, but to me, the mistakes that were made in the final minute plus of the game were just so frustrating, I think, for fans to watch. And I know when we try to come up with story ideas and what we're going to write about every game, at this point, it feels like a broken record. We're writing and saying and tweeting the same things over and over. But the mistakes that Indiana made down the stretch against Ohio State in that last minute, not being able, Race Thompson to get that post entry pass and after the timeout was big. The defensive breakdown against where EJ Liddell gets the dunk, they had another possession where the shot that they got was a contested look from Tamar Bates, just wasn't the kind of opportunity that you want to get. And then after Ohio State tied the game, there was 5 seconds left, and Indiana just kind of, I don't want to say, I tweeted that they jogged the ball up. It was probably about 80% speed in terms of coming up the court, and they get a contested shot as the horn sounding. What was just your reaction to how Indiana handled the last sequence there in the game? Did you put it on the coaching? Was it the players? A combination of both? Because last night was one of the first times I noticed, people have been on Woodson this season for substitution patterns and different things, but last night it seemed like people were really disappointed just in terms of how Indiana handled that final stretch in regulation.
I mean, I think it's a combination of both. But the thing that I guess stood out to me was, you're coming out of a timeout up 4 with the ball, and that turnover by Race Thompson, I think that was really the turning point, because if you're coming out of a timeout, that means you should have, they should have something set. You're able to kind of compose yourself. You're able to take a little bit of a breath. And to have that straight out of the timeout, I think was really bad. And then, it to me also feels like, the Parker Stewart 3 against Wisconsin, and that Indiana just kind of froze. And I feel like that can be said with the Tamar Bates 3, because that stood out to me as well, is that how bad of a shot that was, where you have Tamar Bates taking a contested 3 as the shot clock runs down, and I can't really remember what exactly happened in that possession, but I would guess that there wasn't much movement, and it was kind of people standing around, which it seems like Indiana's offense has been mostly. But it's just like Indiana's just freezing with the game on the line. That just seems to be kind of the consistent thread, in that the clutch factor, in the clutch, I guess, gene, if you would say, isn't something that Indiana has really been able to display at all.
Do you think that's more a function of coaching and scheme, or the players that are on the roster? Because some people are arguing that Indiana has enough talent to be better than this, and others think that they need to have some upgrades, obviously, at certain positions on the perimeter where certain guys are maybe too one-dimensional. I'm just kind of curious if you see this as a singular issue with coaching or scheme or players, or a combination of all those things.
I think Indiana has, in my eyes, the talent to make the NCAA tournament without a question. They have the talent to make it to the NCAA tournament. And if you even look at the Purdue game, is that Indiana beats Purdue without Trace Jackson Davis pretty much playing the entire game. And to me, it's not, could there be upgrades in some positions? Absolutely. Could they use more bench depth? Absolutely. But to me, the excuse of, the talent isn't there doesn't really do it for me, because they have the talent, in my opinion, they should be in the NCAA tournament. Now, do they have the talent to win the Big Ten? I don't think so. But if you're setting the bar, and which was what I set for Mike Woodson's first year, so I think it's a success if you make the NCAA tournament, because in my eyes, the Trace Jackson Davis coming back, you have some transfers. The talent is, there's enough talent. It might not be as much as a team, like Illinois, but the talent is there. If you look at Rutgers, I mean, Rutgers is kind of doing what Indiana needed to do down the stretch of the season. If you compare Rutgers roster and IU's roster, I don't know if you necessarily say, one has far and away better talent than the other, but Rutgers has gone hot. They won 4 straight games against ranked teams, and it's still kind of up in there whether they're going to make the tournament, but they're obviously trending in the right direction. So, yeah, I think if you look at the Big Ten rosters, and you can throw Iowa in this too, I don't think Iowa has much more talent than Indiana. I mean, they may have less. So I do put it on to a certain extent, just the way that Indiana has been able to fit together. And I don't think it's It's not a factor of them not playing hard, or not putting together the effort. But I think that that's kind of where you get into the collection of things where just not being able to make plays at the right time, a few coaching miscues. You have 5 guys get suspended against Northwestern. I don't think that can really go unnoticed, because I feel like that was a big part of the season. But I think it's not one thing. It's not one player. It's not one coach. It's a kind of a collection of things.
So where does Indiana go from here? Obviously, there's a game coming up on Thursday against Maryland. I think in terms of the schedule, the way it's laid out here, it might be a good thing that Maryland's up next, because if it was Rutgers, Rutgers would be coming in. I know they lost recently at Purdue, but they're playing as well as anybody right now in the Big Ten. So it may be a little bit advantageous for Indiana to have Maryland next, a team that's firmly in the bottom of the league, a chance to maybe get a win. And then obviously they go to Minnesota on Sunday. Do you feel like this is a team that's going to be able to change the momentum based on what we've seen recently with 5 straight losses? Do you think I think the talent's there, obviously, to win these next couple of games. And I honestly think if they played to their potential, they could win the next 3 and put themselves right back in the conversation. But at some point, the negativity in terms of the losing has to creep into the locker room. And I wonder if Indiana has the guy in the locker room that's going to be able to turn this negative momentum around. What are your thoughts on just this team in terms of its mental state and whether or not it's going to be able to change momentum after this string of 5 straight losses?
You mentioned something there that I wanted to point out. You said if they play to their potential. And I feel like that's something you could point to, especially even going back to last season, that if they play, you're kind of just waiting. You're waiting. Like, it seems like you're just waiting for them to finally put it together, to finally have stuff kind of click, and it doesn't happen. And so far we've kind of seen that this season. So I feel like, at this point in the season, you would have obviously liked to see things start to trend in the right direction. But I think if there's a 3-game stretch that you can try to build some momentum, that this is the one to do it. I mean, you have Maryland at home and Minnesota away. Those are 2 games that are certainly winnable. Rutgers at home is going to be difficult, but that is definitely a winnable game. This is a stretch that Indiana could very well go 3-0 in. And, like I said before, it's like if they can play to their potential, that's kind of the huge question that is unanswered. And I think, if the season can be over if they lose 1 or even 2 of these next 3 games. I mean, I think for every one of the next 3 games that you lose, then that's another one you have to win in the Big Ten tournament. So, if you drop on the road to Minnesota, then you probably have to win 2 games in the Big Ten tournament. It's kind of it's the same game that Indiana's played the last couple of seasons where, it might come down to the Big Ten tournament and how they fare. Now, if they can win these 3 and somehow, pull off a upset over Purdue, I think they're pretty safely in my opinion. But, if there's a stretch to try to turn it around, this is it. But if they can't turn it around now, then that's pretty much it.
I had some questions come in from the Inside the Hall community. I let everyone know this morning that you were going to be on the show and let people submit some questions. So kind of putting you on the spot with a couple of these, but we can talk through these questions, picking out a few here. Tom asks, the team is 16-10. What do you think their record would be without the transfer portal? No Xavier Johnson, no Miller Kopp, no Michael Durr additions this offseason. What do you think I guess his question is, was Indiana helped by the transfer portal, or was it hurt ultimately by the transfer portal?
So is this assuming that Armand Franklin, Al Durham, Joey Brunk are still on the roster?
he didn't say that, but if there was no transfer portal, I guess you would assume that those guys would still be around.
I think, to me, looking back on it, and I know Armaan Franklin hasn't had the best season from an efficiency standpoint, but Armaan Franklin is kind of what Indiana has really missed this year, in that he's a guy that can do everything. I mentioned about guys being one-dimensional. Well, he's kind of he has the ability to knock down threes. He has the ability to drive and make plays. He has the ability to hit the mid-range jump shot. He has the ability to be a really good defender. So looking back, I think Indiana has missed him really badly because he is a multi-dimensional player that, Indiana has just kind of lacked this season. For trying to think about a record, man, that's tough. I think that Joey Brunk, I don't even think he played against IU yesterday, but I think he'd probably give out as much or more than Michael Durr to this point of the season. Al Durham, I think that Indiana would, at least have the same record. I don't see them being any worse with those pieces. Maybe they win a couple extra games. Having a guy like Armaan Franklin, maybe they're a game or two better. I don't think they're much worse though.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's kind of a hypothetical that we could never really answer, but it's tough to say. I mean, I think Xavier Johnson has been criticized a lot for things that probably are somewhat out of his control. I mean, he's been given the role by the coaching staff, and I think the role that he's playing is to try to create offense on a team that doesn't have a lot of guys that can do much with the ball. And he's obviously been up and down, but I think he's done a lot of good things. And there are some games that Indiana probably wouldn't have won had he not played as well. So kind of following up on the transfer portal, there's another question here about college basketball in general. Do you think the use of the transfer portal will increase, decrease, or remain about the same? Why? I think, I've said this repeatedly on the community when people ask me about it. I go on a radio show down here in Southern Indiana every week with Matt Dennison, and we talk a lot about recruiting. And I think that moving forward, the transfer portal is going to be a big part of any plan for any college basketball team, because realistically, when you're looking for help for the next season at that time of year in the spring, it's easier to go get somebody who can impact your program out of the transfer portal than it is to try to sign somebody late or go get a junior college guy. Tyler, what do you think, just moving forward, how the transfer portal is going to impact college basketball? We've seen the number of transfers each year continue to go up, and you can make an argument whether or not it's good for the game and it's good for guys to move freely from school to school. I think it's great that they've now allowed guys the one-time transfer without sitting out, because it kind of gives guys a chance to get a new start if they don't feel like they're in the best position. But I'm curious your thoughts on the portal and whether or not it becomes more important, less important, or stays about the same moving forward.
I think, to me, one of the biggest impacts is that there's less emphasis, or I don't know, emphasis is the right word, but there's less stakes kind of in the high school recruiting circuit now. You miss on a high school guy and it's not as big of a deal anymore. Why? Because you can go to the transfer portal and get a guy that has been in the league for, been playing college basketball for 2 to 3 years. And I would say that probably a lot of coaches prefer that at this point, that where if you need to fill a forward position, instead of going and looking at the incoming freshman class, let's go get a guy that, has experience playing at the college level and is going to be able to fit into the program much more seamlessly and can kind of get plugged in right away. Because you look at some of the impact transfers this season, Oscar Sheboy, you can go into the portal and get a guy that is going to average 15 and 15 or whatever he is a game. that's ridiculous. You can't. There's very few freshmen, probably outside of maybe the top 10 guys ranked in the class, that would be able to do that. And same thing, you could say the same thing for Walker Kessler, going from UNC to Auburn. So I think that the transfer portal is going to continue to be a really important part of not only college basketball, but college athletics as a whole. And that also, these coaching staffs are going to have to put, as much investment into trying to get transfer portal guys than maybe even high school guys. Because I think you could make the argument that you would much rather have a really good transfer portal recruiting class than you would want to have a high school recruiting class. And I guess you could look at it both ways too. In that, high school recruiting class, you're building for the future more. You're investing in guys long term, where at the transfer portal, you're looking for something much quicker that might only be around for a year or two. But I think regardless, it's going to continue to play a big role in college sports.
DW76 asks, what is one roster move Woodson regretted the most? Any thoughts on that, Tyler? That's, I hate to speak specifically on certain players and whether or not they're a good or a bad fit. I will say in general, I think the one thing that maybe wasn't accounted for enough was wing players who can do more than one thing effectively. And in defense of what Indiana did in the transfer portal, it's not like those guys are just walking around ready to transfer, that are easy to find. I mean, we talk about getting better guard play and guys that can do more than just catch and shoot and go off the dribble. I mean, the absolute best players that can do that are going on to the professional ranks. And when you're going into the portal and looking for guys, there's obviously impact guys like Oscar Sheba, you mentioned Walker Kessler, but there's also a lot of guys who, are trying to move up a level in college basketball. There's guys who didn't work out at their previous stop. One thing that quite frankly, I've been just a little bit surprised about, and I don't know the full backstory of how things have gone behind the scenes. I've been a little bit surprised at the lack of development of Christian Lander, just because I thought at minimum right now he would at least be a solid contributor, maybe not a starter, maybe not a guy that's playing 25 or 30 minutes a game, but at least I think his skill set coming into college was one of a guy that could make plays off the dribble and was a pretty good passer. And his impact on Indiana's basketball program now through 2 seasons has basically been nothing. I mean, he's had a couple of minutes where he's played well in certain games, but in terms of being a contributor with any regularity, his impact has been minimal.
Yeah, and I think to me, his defense is the thing that is just holding him back exponentially. In that, he hasn't been able, when he has been in the game, it seems like he picks up a foul within a minute or two, and it seems like the opposing teams are kind of picking him off and taking him one-on-one, going right by him. And because of the emphasis that Mike Woodson has put on defense, he just, if you can't play defense, I guess, he's not going to really fit into the system. And I think as much as he might add offensively and being able to create a spark, he's just not reliable enough defensively right now. And, I'm interested to see kind of how it plays out moving forward. It's just so hard to predict anymore, really, because like we were talking about the transfer portal, you don't know, who's going to come in, who's going to go out. And on top of that, you have guys like Race Thompson and Rob Finney, who they both can return next season if they wanted to, if I'm correct. But they could also move on. So, yeah, I mean, who knows what exactly Indiana's roster will look like next season. And I don't know what other questions you have, but, I'm curious to know from you, from the roster standpoint, is that do you see Trace Jackson Davis leaving after this season? It seemed like when he decided to come back that this was kind of going to be it. But, to me, and I think to a lot of other people, he's used his right hand a little bit more and he's blocked shots at a higher rate. But I don't know if you've necessarily said he's made that jump to where he's a surefire NBA prospect that's going to be, drafted in the first or, even middle of the second round. It seems like he's kind of late second round in most mock drafts. So, I'm interested to see kind of what his decision is. Obviously, a lot of basketball left to play in this season, but kind of what his path will be moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's real interesting with him, just his the lack of expansion onto the perimeter. That's one thing that has been a little bit head scratching to me, because a guy like Hunter Dickinson at Michigan, he's 2 or 3 inches bigger than Trace, and just a bigger guy. He's stepping out and shooting threes. Luka Garza, we saw at Iowa, expand his game throughout his career. Trace, to me, seems like a guy that should at least go out there and try to shoot a little bit on the perimeter. I think that would really open things up for his game, because right now he's just so one-dimensional in terms of how you guard him. He's in the post, and I don't know how much of that is a function of Indiana's offense and just where they want him. Mike Woodson has kind of said that he doesn't feel like Trace has the confidence to take 3-point shots, but his NBA stock is definitely interesting. It's something we're obviously going to have to keep an eye on here as we get to the spring. But I think one thing that could be potentially in play in terms of whether or not he comes back or whether he goes pro is just what the NIL landscape looks like, and whether or not he feels like if he did come back for another season, whether it could be lucrative for him to do that, because obviously guys that have put up the numbers that he has at Indiana don't typically stay for 4 years. I mean, really the last player that stayed their whole career that was kind of on the same level in terms of points and production. I mean, Jawan Morgan stayed for 4 years, but he wasn't really looked at as an NBA prospect too much. He did play a little bit in the NBA, and Yogi Ferrell obviously played for 4 years, but he was a smaller point guard. Typically, front court players that have put up the type of production that he has in the Big Ten don't stay for 4 years. I just don't know how much he can change his stock coming back for another season. So I think a lot of it's going to come down to whether or not he just wants to move on and do something different, and whether or not it makes sense for him just to try to go get a two-way contract in the NBA or a G League contract, try to work his way onto a roster. I don't necessarily see him as a guy that has much of a chance at all to get picked in the first round. It could be a team that maybe looks at him late in the second round or wants to bring him in as kind of a camp guy or a two-way guy and give him a chance to work his way in. But I mean, if his game is limited to post-ups and playing around the basket, I just don't see how that lends itself to much of a career in the NBA, given how undersized he is. Even Jawan Morgan could shoot the ball a little bit from the perimeter as an undersized forward and do some things with the ball. And he obviously got a short run in the NBA, but now is back in the G League. Kent Wyatt asks, how is recruiting going 2023 specifically? And I can touch on this just briefly. Obviously, Indiana, I think, has done a really good job early in 2023 with picking up commitments from Ja'Kai Newton and Gabe Cupps. Newton is the guy, Tyler, that you wrote extensively about. Got to know a little bit about him. I think the good thing about having a couple commits early in that class is now it can let Indiana be a little bit more selective on what it wants to do with the other spots there. Obviously, I think they need help in the front court in that class. The more immediate need, though, could be for next season, depending on what the roster looks like with the front court, who stays or goes. If Race Thompson and Trace Jackson Davis both decide to move on, that leaves a lot of production that's going to have to be accounted for. I think at that point you have to definitely go in the transfer portal. Just Tyler, big picture. I know Ken asked about 2023 specifically, but How do you feel Indiana's done in recruiting with the 2022 and 23 classes so far? I mean, they've got CJ Gunn coming in, Caleb Banks, Jalen Hood-Schifino. I think those Hood-Schifino is the guy that people are most excited about because of his ranking. But I think they've done a pretty good job so far with the guards and the wings that they're going to bring into the program. But now you kind of wonder what's going to happen with the front court moving forward.
Yeah, I think Mike Woodson has done a tremendous job on the recruiting front, and that was one of the biggest questions, I think, coming in for him as a first time college basketball coach, is that, was he going to be able to connect with recruits? Was he going to be able to recruit at a high level? And I think that pretty quickly, starting with Trace Jackson Davis coming back and also being able to get Tamar Bates, that those concerns were put to bed. And I think the biggest thing that I think has stood out to me about Mike Woodson is in terms of recruiting, and it's not even just recruiting, but how people have talked about how genuine he is, how he's real, how he, doesn't have to be humble, but he is really humble. And I think as members of the media, we've kind of gotten a feel for that as we've interacted with him this season. Is that, he is a guy that, doesn't really have much of an ego, it seems. And I think that is extremely helpful on the recruiting front, in that being able to go into someone's home or just being able to interact. And we know how big relationships are when it comes to that. And I think, Yazir Rosemond and Kenya Hunter too, they definitely deserve some credit for the job that they've been able to do. And Indiana able to, with Yazir Rosemond, his ties in the South, get a guy like Caleb Banks. It doesn't seem like the last couple of seasons on the previous coaching staff that Indiana was able to go into the South as much and get guys, get recruits from there. So now, you have Kenya Hunter with ties to the DMV. You have Yazir Rosemond, ties to the South. So I think that Indiana has set itself up really well in terms of kind of its recruiting network, being able to get guys nationally to continue to try to build momentum on the recruiting front. So yeah, all those factors, I think, pretty quickly Indiana has done about a good job as you could have wanted, early, kind of as the staff has been put together.
Last thing, and before we wrap this up, Tyler, Andy Bottoms has his latest bracketology on Inside the Hall this morning. Indiana is listed, I believe, as the first team on the first five out, last four in: Rutgers, North Carolina, Loyola Chicago, and Michigan. What does Indiana need to do here in your mind to close the season, to break the streak and get back to the tournament for the first time since 2016?
I think it starts with these three games coming up. I think Indiana pretty much needs to win all three. If they can't win all three, they need to make a pretty significant run in the Big Ten tournament, knock off a team in the top 25. I think if they're somehow able to win the last four regular season games of the season, I think you feel pretty comfortable about them getting in. But to me, it's looking like a situation where, you're going to definitely have to win, probably in most likelihood, if they don't beat Purdue, you're going to have to win the first game of the Big Ten tournament to feel like you have a chance. And then, depending on what other bubble teams are doing, you're going to have to potentially win a second. And I think this is where just the kind of the situation that you didn't want to be in if you're Indiana, because now you're looking at, they could possibly get bumped out of the field if someone runs the table in one of the smaller conference tournaments, and steals a bid, or, you're looking at the fate, at this point, I think they still somewhat have the fate in their hands if they can win out, but it's looking increasingly at this point like their fate isn't in their hands. If they drop another one or two games, it's going to be partially what they're able to do and partially what other teams are able to do.
We'll be covering it down the stretch here for Inside the Hall. There's obviously 4 regular season games left, 2 at home, 2 on the road in the Big Ten tournament in Indianapolis. We'll continue to cover it as we always have, and it should be an interesting close to the season. Tyler, thanks for the time this week on Podcast on the Brink. It's always good to talk to you, and thanks everybody for listening. If you enjoy the show, feel free, please leave us a like, or not a like, a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and we'll be back again next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.